Hello class, and welcome back to EDUC 1300. In this lesson, we will discuss one of the 8 habits of successful students, specifically learning to accept personal responsibility. Learning to take responsibility for your actions is one of the best ways to be successful in college and in life. We already know that college educators expect you to take responsibility for your actions in the classroom and be responsible for your learning. But how does that carry over into our daily lives? Psychologist Richard Logan wondered this as well, so he conducted a study of people who had survived traumatic ordeals such as being imprisoned in concentration camps or lost in the frozen Arctic. He found out each of these survivors had a shared belief in that they all saw themselves as personally responsible for creating the outcomes and experiences of their lives. Therefore, we need to address the following questions. Do you accept personal responsibility for creating the life you want? And do you respond wisely to each fork in the road with wise choices that move you closer and closer to your desired outcomes? Also, are you a successful student? Have you adopted a creator mindset by believing that your choices create the outcomes and experiences of your life? Also, have you mastered creator language, in where you've learned to accept personal responsibility for the results? However, before you can adequately address these questions, we first need to define what mindset means. Simply put, a mindset is a collection of beliefs and attitudes that affects the way you see a situation and influences your resulting choices. In other words, how you think about a situation affects how you react to the situation. Therefore, let's look at 2 types of mindsets and how they affect our actions. The first mindset is the victim mindset. A victim mindset causes people to believe that what happens to them is out of their control, and that their outcomes and experiences are determined by such things as luck and other people. When a person demonstrates a victim mindset, they complain, blame, or make excuses which waste valuable energy and causes them to remain stuck in their current situation. In other words, someone with a victim mindset allows the world to dictate their response instead of taking control of the situation. Before we move on, I want to make sure I clarify this definition a little. When we refer to the victim mindset, notice I refer to it with a capital V. Therefore, I'm assigning it a proper name. There is a difference between someone acting as a capital V victim and someone who is a victim of circumstances. A little v victim is caught up in a situation beyond their control and are victimized by outside forces. For example, a little v victim may be someone who was hurt in a deadly accident or a weather tragedy. On the other hand, a capital or big V victim is victimized by inside forces. A capital V victim becomes their own oppressor. In spite of the situation, they choose to be oppressed by their own inward beliefs. They become their own oppressor. Therefore, as we move throughout this class, please note that when I mention victim, I'm referring to someone acting as a victim of their own inward oppressions, and not someone in a situation beyond their control. The opposite of the victim mindset is the creator mindset. A creator mindset causes people to believe they control their own destiny by the wisdom of their choices, even though this belief is not always true. Whereas victims spend all of their energy judging themselves or others, creators use their energy to solve the problem. They ask, what are my best options? Or which option will best help me create my desired outcome? Or how can I use my energy to improve? In other words, creators have a mindset where they refuse to be oppressed. So let me ask you this question. Would it improve your current situation to believe and act as if you create all the outcomes and experiences in your life? The key ingredient to taking control of our lives and adopting a creator mindset is to take responsibility for our choices. Therefore, if we want to take ownership of our lives, we need to choose how we respond in different situations. When presented with a stimulus, we all respond whether we realize it or not. When animals respond to a stimulus, it's based on an ingrained instinct or habit. However, as humans, we have a brief, critical moment of decision time to make a choice that falls between the stimulus and our response. Some people choose to ignore the problem altogether. However, not making a choice is indeed making a choice. Accepting too little responsibility is disempowering and is a response of a victim. Also, blaming, complaining, making excuses, or repeating behaviors when presented with the problem is representative of victims' responses. On the other hand, when a creator is presented with a stimulus, he or she makes a choice and decides to seek solutions, take action, or try a different approach. Although a creator may be frustrated with the situation, he or she does not allow the situation to take control of their life or hijack their goals. Sure, he or she may get angry and they may be frustrated. That's perfectly okay. However, a creator moves past that frustration and moves forward towards his or her goals when presented with a challenge. On the other hand, a victim wastes all of his or her energy being frustrated with the problem. So my question to you is this. On the journey that is your life, do you want to be driving the car, letting someone drive you, or do you want to be tied up in the trunk? One way we can move towards accepting personal responsibility and move towards responding as a creator is to become aware of our own self-talk. Self-talk is important because what we say to ourselves can help determine the choices we make. When we listen to the self-talk or inner voices accompanying the victim mindset, we're listening to the voice of our inner critic or our inner defender. The inner critic is the internal voice that judges us as inadequate and blames us for whatever is wrong in life. Furthermore, it can find fault with just about anything about us. The inner critic provides us with toxic self-judgments that we have to overcome to move towards taking responsibility for our own actions. If you've ever said to yourself, "I'm not smart enough to attend college," or "I wish I was as pretty as her," or "I'm just not ever going to be successful," then you are listening to the voice of your inner critic. You may have noticed that the inner critic may sound like a judgmental adult of your past. We form our personalities in the early years of our lives. Therefore, if you've had a judgmental adult tear you down when you were younger, you will likely hear that voice as your inner critic. Therefore, when we listen to the voice of our inner critic, we often find that we are content trading success in the future for comfort in the present. We say things like, "I can't pass math, so I'll just drop the course." However, the relief is only temporary. At some point, you'll still need to take the math class. Therefore, your inner critic has taken over and moved you off course from your goal. Ironically, the inner critic does have a positive intention. It can help us identify flaws we want to eliminate to gain the approval of others. The second inner voice of a victim is the inner defender. The inner defender judges, blames, complains, accuses, criticizes, and condemns others. In other words, the inner defender accepts little responsibility for our problems. Instead, it projects our problems onto someone else. The inner defender convinces us that we are more than worthy. Therefore, it causes us to tear down others to build ourselves up. Again, this inner voice's main purpose is to protect us from discomfort or anxiety. After all, if we can blame someone else, then we do not have to take ownership of the problem. Unfortunately, the inner defender also allows us to protect ourselves by highlighting our prejudices and biases. After all, if we can find fault with others, we look better according to our inner defender. If you've ever said things like, "I would do better in math if my teacher was any good," or if you've ever said, "I can't study because my roommate is too loud," then you're listening to the voice of your inner defender. Where the voice of the inner critic may sound like a judgmental adult of our past, the voice of the inner defender sounds like a scared kid defending his or herself. It may allow us to revert to name-calling and arguing because, after all, it makes us believe it's not my fault, it's their fault. So when we compare the inner voices of a victim, How is the inner critic and inner defender similar? Simply put, they are both voices of judgment. However, the inner critic and inner defender are different in that the inner critic looks inwardly as ourselves being the problem, whereas the inner defender looks outwardly and blames others as the instruments of our failure. The opposite of the inner critic and the inner defender is the inner guide. The inner guide is our wise inner voice that seeks to make the best of any situation. Furthermore, it realizes that judgments, either at ourselves or others, do not improve difficult situations. Simply put, the inner guide is the impartial truth and is the voice of a creator. When we listen to our inner voice, we eliminate the judgment of ourselves and others. Instead, we focus on the situation at hand and come up with real solutions, instead of wasting time assigning blame to either ourselves or others. So as we wrap up this section, I'd like for you to look at this chart that describes the fallacies of the inner critic and inner defender voices of victim language. Also, I'd like you to notice how if we learn to translate our victim statements into the responsible language of creators, we move from stagnant judgment to dynamic action. Simply put, if we can change our inner conversation, we learn to own the problem and therefore can create a plan. After all, what do you want out of life? Excuses or results? That's all for now. See you next time.